Hey, good morning. I am sorry that a little bit late. You have no idea the frustration that takes place trying to do this. Um, Tried 4 times, and excuse me, but I still am arranging stuff. Tried 4 times, and none of them worked. So anyway, here we are. Good morning. Welcome to day 4 of week 4, and nobody's here. So I have no idea if this is even working. We'll figure it out. This is getting to be a major source of frustration. But anyway, welcome to day 4 of week 4 of loving God. Man, that's kind of odd, isn't it? Talking about frustration and loving God in the same sentence. So I have no idea. Um, if this is playing at all. Anyway, take a deep breath. I want to tell you a story about Gene. Gene's the guy that I knew casually. Um, he ran a business in a town where I was a pastor, and I ran into him at times. I knew some of his family members. He had some in-laws that came to our church. Gene was not a Christian, not a follower of Jesus Christ. He was not involved in a church anywhere. Pretty earthy kind of guy, but in his 60s, in his mid 60s, Gene he was diagnosed with liver cancer, and it was a pretty serious diagnosis. And through his in-laws that I knew who came to my church, they asked if I would pay a visit to Gene, and Gene was willing and open to have me visiting. Good morning, Cindy. I'm glad you got connected and found out here. I Anyway, so I got connected with Gene. Gene was willing to have me make a visit, and we visited. And Gene was very, very honest about his life and his situation, his diagnosis of liver cancer. And we started having some very, very deep conversations. Gene, as I said, Gene was not a follower of Jesus, very little church in his background. Never really had gone to church. So Gene had a lot of questions about what he was going through. He knew his diagnosis was terminal. And Gene asked questions like, what's it like to die? How do you believe in God? How do you believe in Jesus Christ? And he asked questions about forgiveness. How do you know you're forgiven? Um, and so, in all of those really deep, really significant conversations that we were having as Gene dealt with his terminal diagnosis of liver cancer, we um, we got very close and we got very connected. And Gene actually started attending church with his with his family. They Gene became a Christian on his own at some point and let me know about it. And then Gene's diagnosis, his cancer diagnosis, progressed with all of the ugly complications that go with that kind of cancer. His legs started to swell up. His belly started to swell up, and I started meeting with Gene at least once a week. I would stop over at his house and we would have conversations. And most of those conversations were very deep conversations. One day I got a phone call. I did not live far from Gene. Good morning, Marianne. Um, I didn't live far from Gene. And one day I got a phone call from his in-law that I knew from church. And she said, Dad needs you. Can you go? So I went, and Gene had suddenly taken a very significant turn for the worse. Good morning, Angelica. He was lying in his bed, and he was immobile. We knew that he was now in the final stages of liver cancer. And Gene had soiled himself in his bed. And when I walked into his bedroom, there was kind of this overwhelming smell. And Gene's wife was there. In fact, she met me at the door and she said, Gene asked me to call you, and I'm so sorry to call you in this situation. But when I walked into Gene's bedroom, As I said, you walk in and it was obvious immediately that he had soiled himself in his bed. And his first sentence to me was, he said, "I knew you would come." And that sentence, I've never forgotten that moment. That sentence um, just kind of wrecked me in that moment. I knew you'd come. So he and his wife, we lifted Gene out of his bed. That was the first time that we knew that he was immobile, couldn't get out of his bed. And that's why he ended up soiling himself in his bed. We lifted him out together. We put him on a commode, which was right next to his bed. And I helped to clean Gene up, helped to clean up his sheets and change his bed. And Gene could not stop saying thank you to me and also sorry at the same time. He kept saying, "I'm so sorry," because it was quite a mess, and also saying thank you. And that for me, that moment when I walked into his bedroom and Gene looked at me and said, "I knew you'd come," that was a defining moment for me, a moment I've never forgotten. It was a moment, that experience, being in that bedroom with Gene when we knew that he was close to death and when he really needed help. It was a defining moment. I rarely have felt so deeply connected with another human being and with God. It was a moment when, in loving Gene, I knew that I was also loving God. Now I know that there are many of you who are nurses and nurses aid and hospice workers who have moments like that very often, when you spend a lot of time cleaning soiled sheets and cleaning soiled clothing and cleaning soiled bodies. And we're very grateful for what you do for us. But that's not a common moment for me. And that moment, combined with the weeks, probably half a year of weekly visits with Gene and very deep conversations, and that moment when he said, "I knew you'd come," and then being in his room and helping to clean him up and to lift his very frail body, put it on a commode, was a moment in which I was deeply connected with Gene and with God. And I knew that that was what God would want done. I knew that that was a moment when God was, even in the midst of a terminal illness, it was a moment when God was, I knew, smiling on what we were doing. And I felt the experience of loving Gene and loving God in that moment. Gene didn't last long after that. It wasn't too many weeks or even too many days, actually, before Gene passed away. But I knew that he'd gone home. In fact, he started talking about heaven that way, that he was going home. I knew that he'd come to Christ. I was able to be the pastor at his funeral, and that whole experience of caring for Gene was an experience of loving God. And that is the experience that those of you who are caregivers, who care for people, this is one of the pathways for us. This is one of the ways that all of us love God, but it's particularly true for some of you who are mercy givers, who are caregivers. One of the ways that we connect with God and one of the ways that we love God is through the process of caring for other people, like that experience that I had with Gene. And some of you excel at this. Some of you are such good caregivers. It's a particular gift and passion that you have. And this is a way in which you have learned to love other people and love God. I think Jesus, as we've talked about all week long, I think Jesus demonstrated all of these pathways. He was good at all of them, and Jesus was an exceptionally good caregiver. There are stories in the New Testament, stories in the Gospels about how Jesus at times would be exhausted, but being exhausted never stopped him from seeing people who needed care and taking the time to stop and meet their needs. Um, one of the stories of Jesus that demonstrate this, he was asked by somebody to come to a house to help somebody who was ill. And on the way, the crowds talks about the crowds who were going with him. They wanted to see what Jesus was going to do. They were following. The crowds are pressing in on him. And there's a story about a woman who had an issue of bleeding for years, and she thought, if I could just touch him. She didn't want to bother him, so she just snuck up and she grabbed hold of Jesus for just a second. And even though Jesus was in the midst of this busyness, and even though he was exhausted from caring for people, the story talks about how he stopped and he said, "Who touched me?" Not because he wanted to call out somebody, but just because he wanted to know who it was, because he cared deeply about people. There's a story or two about how Jesus would occasionally see the crowds of people, and he would weep and he would say, they're lost, they're sheep without a shepherd, because he felt the need to care for people who were lost. He told one of his most famous stories is the story of the Good Samaritan, about two people who didn't care for somebody who'd been beaten up and left alongside of the road. And then, he tells the story about a Samaritan, an outsider, a non-Jew, who came along and saw and who cared. And Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." So Jesus is constantly, demonstrating this caregiving and encouraging us to do the same. But for some of you, this is a particular gift and a particular pathway. I don't know if you know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, but we tell the story the way we tell the story. We think we know why Sodom and Gomorrah was judged, and we attribute it to sexual sin. But in the book of Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel actually gives a different twist on the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and the punishment, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And in Ezekiel said, now this was the sin of your sister Sodom, speaking of Sodom as if she's a person. This was the sin of your sister Sodom. And Ezekiel said, she and her daughters, meaning her sister cities, she and her daughters were arrogant and overfed and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy. And Ezekiel talks about the fact that the destruction of Sodom was because it was Sodom first. And they gave up on helping the poor and the needy, and it led to their destruction. It's a significant story for us to pay attention to. So I know that, one of the things that just impresses me about Horizon Church is, I'm sorry. One of the things that impresses me about Horizon is often the way that you care for people. So, Horizon is full of caregivers, people who make meals for other people who give rides to hospitals, people who, and to doctors, people who actually will sit with you when you're in the hospitals, meet with you, people who clean houses for other people who mow and who rake and who shovel and who paint, people who watch kids, people who are involved in foster care, and people who adopt, and just this overwhelming the number of caregivers at hospital. I met with a woman last night. There was a woman that I met with who just was looking for some, counsel. And we chatted, and I know this person. She comes to Horizon, and I know that she had been deeply hurt by church in her past, grew up in church, but was deeply hurt. But she came to a point a couple of years ago where she wanted to reconnect with church, and she knew she wanted Christ in her life. So she came to church, and I don't know how she found Horizon. I think she actually knew one or two people, and she'd been invited. And she was told, you'll be welcome at Horizon, even given, how deeply you've been hurt. So she came alone. And on her first Sunday at Horizon, she told me last night, she said, Pat Weber came up to her, introduced herself, and Pat said to her, "Why don't you sit with me?" And Pat said, "I sit in the front, you have to sit in the front, but why don't you come and sit with me?" And she did. And this woman last night, she told me that moment made all the difference. She said, that's when my recovery began, her recovery from being hurt from church. So just that little act of caring for somebody went such a long way. So caregiving, this ability to care for others, is one of the pathways. It's one of the ways we connect. with God, and one of the ways we love God. And for some of you who have big hearts, who are mercy givers and who caregivers, this is a way you connect with God. And for me, um, as I said, that moment with Gene, I will never forget that moment walking into his bedroom, being hit with the smell, and then hearing him say, "I knew you'd come." It was a moment for me of deep connection with a human being and deep connection with God, knowing that what I was doing, I was loving God. So for some of you, this is it. This is how you care. One more I want to talk about briefly. So this would be number 7 as we've been going through these different ways of connecting. And I don't know, I'm using a book I told you called Sacred Pathways by Gary Thomas, using it kind of generally. But he lists 9 pathways. And again, I think that there's just this infinite mix of ways that we connect. But we talked about connecting with God through nature. We talked about connecting with God through art and through our senses. We talked about connecting with God through ritual and symbolism. We talked about connecting with God through solitude and simpleness. We talked about connecting with God as activists, and then just finished talking about connecting with God as caregivers. And this next one I want to talk about is, I don't know a word for it, but I'm going to call it enthusiasts or adventurers, or those who love celebration. And this is for those of you who just love the celebration of worship. I really enjoy, I always get to sit in front during worship services. And I love how so many people just really enjoy worship. And when we finish kind of the celebratory songs, there's always the woohoo and the clapping. And I love those moments. And there are some of you who look for and who expect and who enjoy just exuberant celebration. And there are those of you who are like this, often are people who look for and expect power in prayer. You look for God to do something, and you pray big prayers, and it's almost as if you pray these adventurous prayers. And those are people that I think of as enthusiasts and adventurers. And the Bible's full of cool stories about people who are like this. There's a great story in 2 Samuel chapter 6, kind of a well-known story. David, the leaders of Israel are in the process of bringing the Ark of the Covenant. You know, the Ark of the Covenant, 10 Commandments were in this thing, and the whole Raiders of the Lost Ark, all those movies. So they're bringing the Ark of the Covenant into the city of Jerusalem. And the story is that David led the way, and he was the king, and he danced. The scripture says he danced with all his might. And his wife actually sees this from a window. She sees David coming, dancing with all his might, and she's embarrassed for David. And she calls David on the carpet and said, "You humiliated yourself in front of all of Israel." And David responds by saying, "I don't care if I humiliated myself." His point was, he said, "I am going to dance before God enthusiastically." And he did. And David was just, David, all those Psalms he wrote, so many of them, are heartbreaking, but he has these enthusiastic, just shout, he says, for joy and sing for joy. And that's David, just this enthusiastic, adventurous person who loves celebrating. And some of you are this way, and you love connecting with God this way. There's another story I love, lesser well known, but it's in Nehemiah chapter 8. And Nehemiah, as you know, Nehemiah is a story. It's a book that happens after Israel loses their country. Israel as a country really exists no more. And the Jewish people have been exiled, and they're living in Babylon. And the story of, the Babylon, by the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept because they'd lost their temple. They'd lost their cities that was in ruin. So Nehemiah comes along. Nehemiah is, he's an advisor for the king of Persia. And Nehemiah hears that the walls of Jerusalem are torn down, that the city, that Israel's a wreck, and he asks the king if he can go back and rebuild the walls, and he does. And he goes back and he helps rebuild the walls, and they get to the place in the book of Nehemiah where the walls are rebuilt. But you need to understand, even though the walls are rebuilt, they are nothing to look at compared to the grandeur that Jerusalem once was. So they finish rebuilding the walls. The people all gather together, and Ezra is there, who wrote the book of Ezra is about him. And Ezra and Nehemiah, they gather all the people of Jerusalem together. And Nehemiah spends a day reading the law, reading the Torah to the people of Israel. And the people start weeping. They start weeping because they're reminded of all that they have lost. They look at the walls, and although the walls are rebuilt, they know that these walls are nothing compared to what they once were. And so they sit there weeping over all that they've lost. And Nehemiah interrupts and he stops them and he says, "This is not a day for weeping." And he says to them, "Go home and celebrate." And his point was, look, we're rebuilding, and it's a time not to weep for what we've lost, but it's to celebrate the future that we have with God. And he actually says, in Nehemiah 8, you can read this. I love the phrase. He says, "Go home and eat the fat." That's what he says literally, eat the fat. And what he means is go home and eat the Oreos, go home and eat the peanut butter eggs, go home and eat the rich foods, eat the good stuff. He said, don't go home and eat the vegetables today. Go home and eat the good stuff. It's a party day. And he also says, go home and drink the sugary drinks, go home and drink the Coke, drink the wine. It's not a day for bread and water. And then he says this is key. He says, because the joy of the Lord is our strength. And what he was telling the people, those of you who are like this, and all of us are partly, we all have this in us. He's saying, look, that it's when we experience the joy of God, when we are enthusiastic in celebrating God, that is our strength. He's saying that's how we experience strength. That's so for some of us, that's how we experience the love of God. That's how we love God. So this idea, this is key to some of you, those of you who are adventurers and who are enthusiasts and who love celebration. And I don't know if you know this, but many of the sacrifices in the Old Testament, the sacrifices that the Jewish people did, I didn't know this for years and years. Many of them were actually intended to be feasts that people would have. In other words, you bring an animal, you give the animal to the priest, the animal would be killed and it'd be sacrificed, and some of the meat would be or the fat of the animal, some of the meat would be sacrificed on the altar. The priest would get some, but very often the people got the rest of the meat back. And what they were intended to do is to have a feast and to celebrate have a feast with God. And they were in essence many celebrations that people would have. So that's what God was looking for. He was looking forward to just having a meal with us and to celebrate with us. So there are many of you who have this kind of heart. You're the creators, you're the artists, and you love celebration. You're the enthusiasts, you're the adventurers. And I have not done a really good job about talking about the fact that everything we're talking about is true, not just in the church context, but it's true outside of church. It's true in life. And this is especially one of those areas I was reminded that this is true outside of church too. So for those of you who are enthusiasts and who are adventurers, and go whitewater rafting and love God through doing that. I mean, jump out of an airplane. I got to do that once, and it was fun. And it's a very expensive hobby. I'm never going to do it more than once, I don't think. But it was a blast. Some of you are entrepreneurs. You have that spirit of just kind of riskiness. You want to start new things all the time. And man, this is how you love God. So don't forget that this is true for us, not just in our church context of loving worship, but this is true for us through all of life. All of these things are, all of these gifts are, all of them, as we talk about them, pathways to God. Not just true in church, but true outside of church. So when you do these things, those of you who are adventurous and who love the enthusiasm of worship, this is true for you all the time. So when you do this, this is how you're loving God, and do it with God and involve God. Jump out of an airplane with God and thank Him for the ability to have adventure. So two things that we talked about today. Some of you are caregivers, and as you care for people, it's exhausting sometimes, but this is how you love God. And sometimes there are going to be moments when you feel that. And some of us are enthusiasts and adventurers, and we love having adventures with God. So do that as well. So anyway, glad you guys are plugged in this morning, and love you all. I'm going to pray, and then we get on with our day. All right. Father, thanks for the day that you've given us today. Thank you for the chance we have to connect on these mornings. I thank you, God, for people who get plugged in. And Father, I pray that God, that through our connections with you, whether we're caring for people or whether we're, having some act of adventure and celebration, I pray that we'd have the ability to connect deeply and to be reminded that you love us, but also to be reminded that we love you as well. I pray, God, that you bless us as we get to go through this day. Remind us that we get to go through this day with you. Everything that happens, we do with you. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, everybody, love you all. And hope you guys have a great day, and see you tomorrow at 9:00.